black CEO is invited on live TV to talk about his success, but the interview turns into a setup. He fires back with sharp truths that shake America. What happened next? This story doesn't end here. Jordan Miles was working in his 22nd floor office in downtown Austin, Texas, when the email came in. The subject line was short: Invitation from America Now, a major national TV show, primetime slot. They wanted him to appear in a special segment titled Black Voices in Tech, a Success Story. At first glance, the invite seemed flattering. CipherGuard, the cybersecurity company he founded, had just secured a $150 million contract with the Department of Defense. The media had started paying attention, but Jordan didn't celebrate. He knew how these shows worked. They brought black faces on for a few feel-good minutes, just enough to check the diversity box before returning to business as usual. Sometimes success stories like his were used to paint a pretty picture, not to spark real conversation. His assistant Brianna noticed the email too. She walked in holding his coffee and asked, "You sure about this? I've seen shows like that lift people up and tear them down even faster." Jordan gave a faint smile, but didn't answer right away. His mind drifted back to Detroit, the cramped apartment with no AC, surviving on instant noodles, thinking the startup world belonged to other people. He stared at the screen, then typed out a reply. "I'm in." He wasn't chasing fame, but if the system wanted to put him under the spotlight, he wouldn't walk in like a pawn. He'd walk in like a chess player. And if this was going to be a match, they just invited the wrong opponent to the table. That morning, the skies over Austin were unusually gray. Heavy clouds hovered low, like a quiet warning. Jordan Miles stepped out of a black SUV, dressed in a sharp navy suit. His eyes were steady, focused, but somewhere deep in his gut, a feeling tugged at him. Instinct. And he never ignored his instincts. The America Now studio, located in Midtown, looked sleek and professional, yet eerily soulless. As he walked through the glass doors, there was no warm welcome, no handshake, no producer smiling to ease the nerves, just a young woman in a hoodie holding a clipboard. She barely looked up. "Mr. Miles, this way. You'll be mic'd up in 5. No small talk, no prep. Just another product moving down the assembly line of television content. Jordan took a seat in the chilly green room. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in sterile white. A makeup assistant approached without a word, dabbing powder on his face with robotic motions. Across the room, a monitor showed the live broadcast. A cooking segment was wrapping up, then the transition graphic appeared. The headline read, "Coming up, Black Tech Boom, Real Talent or Special Treatment." Jordan clenched his jaw. Brianna's voice echoed in his mind. "They'll lift you up, just to tear you down." A few rooms away, inside the control booth, Clara Reynolds, longtime host of America Now, was getting mic'd up. She turned to the executive producer. "You sure about this angle? This is going to spark real backlash." The producer smirked. "The more polarizing, the better. Push him to the edge. We need a viral moment." Back on set, the stage was polished and pristine. Soft blue and gold tones gave it a cozy, trustworthy feel. Center stage was a sleek glass coffee table and 2 leather chairs. The lighting was tuned just right, bright enough to make the guests look polished but not warm enough to feel safe. Jordan stepped in, adjusting his tie, taking a deep breath. Cameras floated silently around him, capturing every breath, every blink. Then came Clara, smooth, poised, perfectly put together. She walked onto the set like she owned it. She reached out a hand with a professional smile, just enough to appear friendly. Her eyes, though, were cold steel. "Welcome to America Now, Mr. Miles. So glad to have you." Jordan shook her hand, eyes locked. "Appreciate the invite." Neither of them knew just yet, but this wouldn't be a conversation. This would be a chess match, a collision of 2 worlds, and only one of them would walk away standing tall. The theme music kicked in. Red lights blinked on across the studio. The show was live. Clara faced the camera with a picture-perfect smile and began her intro. "Tonight on America Now, we welcome a very special guest, an inspiring story of resilience and rise. From humble beginnings to a $150 million defense contract, Jordan Miles is rewriting the rules of tech." Jordan listened, but his mind wasn't on the compliments. He was scanning, reading tone, tracking eye movements. This wasn't praise, it was setup. Then came the shift. Clara leaned forward just slightly and asked her opening question. "You grew up in Detroit, right? No connections, no Ivy League, no safety nets. So what got you here?" Jordan gave a slight nod. He knew what this was. That wasn't a question. It was the opening move, and he was ready. The cameras kept rolling. The lights stayed bright. The studio air felt frozen in time. Only the eyes moved, tracking every gesture, every breath exchanged between the host and her guest. Clara smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Her voice was sweet as honey, but every word was sharpened like a blade. "Mr. Miles," she began, "your story is truly inspiring. From growing up in Detroit with no Ivy League degree, no family connections, to landing one of this year's biggest defense contracts, $150 million. That's quite an achievement." Jordan gave a polite nod, his voice calm and even. "Thank you. We worked hard for that. CipherGuard developed an encryption system that outperformed everyone else. That's it." Clara crossed her legs, eyes locked on him. "Some are calling it groundbreaking," she said, then paused, "but there are other views." Jordan didn't flinch. He knew what was coming. Clara picked up a cue card and read aloud, like quoting from a source. "Some industry experts believe CipherGuard may have benefited from federal diversity incentives, that in today's government contracts, factors like representation and inclusion may weigh as heavily as performance, that maybe you didn't just win on merit, but because you fit a narrative." The air in the room shifted. Jordan blinked once, then silence. One beat, two, three. Then came a small smile, neither bitter nor amused, just the kind that comes from hearing something far too many times. "That's always how it goes," he said, voice steady. "When a black entrepreneur wins, it's special treatment. But when a company run by the same wealthy white families wins, nobody questions a thing." A light cough came from behind the cameras. A producer glanced nervously toward the director. Clara kept her composure, but the tension in her posture grew. "So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success?" she asked. Jordan let out a soft chuckle and shook his head. "I'm saying this. When Elon Musk landed those NASA contracts, no one asked if it was because of diversity points. When Jeff Bezos got government deals for Blue Origin, nobody brought up his background. But when the CEO looks like me, the first question is always, did he really earn it?" This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was testimony. Clara paused, choosing her next words. Jordan saw it in her eyes, the next move coming, but he didn't flinch. "I'm not denying that diversity programs have value," Jordan added. "They help level the field, but people forget. It was never level to begin with." Clara nodded slightly, but her eyes said otherwise. "So if those policies didn't exist," she pressed, "do you think you'd still have landed that contract?" Jordan tilted his head, voice sharpened. "If the field were truly fair, I wouldn't have had to go through 3 separate vetting rounds, 4 security audits, and spend 3 years proving we were qualified, while our competitor got fast-tracked after a golf retreat." A few soft murmurs broke out behind the scenes. Someone in the control room muttered, "He's running this show like a pro." And it was true. Jordan wasn't just answering questions. He was controlling the tempo. Each sentence hit with quiet precision. Clara hesitated for a moment, fingers brushing her cue cards. She didn't realize it yet, but Jordan wasn't here just to defend himself. He was here to change the game, and this was only the opening move. Clara sat up straighter, brushing her hair back in a subtle attempt to regain control. Her face still wore the mask of professionalism, but something had shifted in her eyes. Not fear, frustration. The kind that comes when your opponent refuses to fall for your carefully laid trap. She glanced down at her cue cards, then softened her voice, feigning sincerity. "You've said you pulled yourself up. No shortcuts, no handouts. But there's something you haven't mentioned." Jordan's expression didn't change. "Oh?" Clara picked up a sheet of paper and held it just high enough for the cameras to catch a glimpse without revealing the details. "We received an internal document, a registration form from 2017. Back then, CipherGuard applied to the federal minority-owned business program." She looked directly at Jordan, her tone tightening. "So the question is, were you really self-made, or was this all part of a calculated strategy to take advantage of racial incentives?" The tension in the studio tightened like a noose. A few crew members exchanged nervous glances. One of them whispered under his breath, "She went there." Jordan paused for a few seconds, then let out a quiet laugh. Not bitter, not angry, just familiar. "You just described a strategic business decision like it was some kind of confession," he said, voice calm but each word cutting deep. "Yes, we applied. Back then I was sleeping on a floor and selling used computers to keep our servers running." Clara tried to interject, but Jordan raised his hand gently. "Let me finish. When a white-owned startup gets seed money from a college buddy or a hedge fund uncle, it's called smart fundraising. When I access a legal government-approved support program, suddenly it's playing the race card." Silence. Heavy loaded silence. The studio lights were bright, but the sharpest spotlight now came from Jordan's steady gaze, focused, unwavering, slicing through every ounce of manufactured respectability. Clara pressed her lips together, clearly thrown off balance. She started to pivot, but at that exact moment, Jordan's mic cut out. The audience could still see him talking, but no sound came through the broadcast. No warning, no technical difficulties message, just silence. On Twitter, hashtags exploded. Number Y muted. Number let Jordan speak. Brianna, watching from CipherGuard HQ, jumped to her feet. They just muted him. They actually did it. The sound returned after 5 seconds, just as Jordan finished his sentence. A coincidence? Or something more deliberate? Clara jumped in quickly, tone practiced. Apologies for that brief audio issue. Let's move on to the next question. Jordan gave a dry laugh and looked straight into the camera. You know what's funny, Clara? The second I said something uncomfortable, my mic vanished. But that's not new. I've been silenced long before today, since I was 9 years old, raising my hand in class and never getting called on. Since I was 17, applying for loans and getting denied, even with perfect credit. His voice dropped a register, slower and more deliberate. They didn't just cut the mic. They've been cutting our voices for years. No one spoke. 1 beat, 2, 3. Even the director hesitated to cue a commercial. Jordan turned back to Clara, not defensive anymore, just direct. You asked if I truly deserve to be here, so let me ask you, how many white executives get handed leadership positions without ever having to prove themselves? How many sit in seats of power just because they resemble the people who sat there before? Clara blinked, visibly caught off guard. She hadn't expected her silent blow to backfire this hard. Jordan leaned back in his chair, spine straight, gaze locked onto the lens, and the fight wasn't over yet. The air in the studio had shifted. There were no more quiet chuckles from the crew, no more firm directions coming through the earpieces. Everyone stood still, eyes locked on the frame, on the man sitting in that chair, a black man, not shouting, not angry, just calmly telling the truth, and that somehow was what shook people most. Clara, for a brief moment, seemed to feel her anchor chair grow unsteady, but she stuck to the script. She still had one more card to play, the last move the producers had been saving, a direct pivot, a final swing. She tilted her head, voice soft but calculated. Mr. Miles, she said slowly, I understand where your frustration comes from, but some would argue that what you're expressing isn't really about race, that it's resentment, resentment toward big corporations for not recognizing you the way you expected. Jordan let out a quiet laugh. This time the sound carried a trace of bitterness, not toward her, but toward the system she represented. Resentment? He echoed. Number, let's call it what it is. Accountability. Clara paused, just for a beat, but Jordan kept going. You want to know what really bothers me? It's the fairy tale America keeps telling itself. The belief that if you work hard, no matter who you are, you'll make it. He turned and looked directly into the camera. Fairy tales, that's what they are. Fairy tales told by the people who benefit from them. The silence in the studio was no longer awkward. It was heavy, full. Jordan's tone didn't rise. He didn't need to shout. Black entrepreneurs are still denied business loans at twice the rate of white-owned businesses. We still get less than 2% of venture capital funding in this country. And even when we beat the odds, like I'm doing right now, we're still asked, did you really deserve it? Clara didn't respond. Her face remained neutral, but her eyes were listening now. Jordan looked at her, his voice soft but piercing. If my success is enough to prove the system isn't broken, then I guess one person making it out of a burning building means the building was never on fire? He let the words linger in the space between them. My success doesn't mean the system works. It just means I survived something that was never built for me in the first place. Still, the cameras didn't cut. No commercial, no interjection. The control room was silent. Everyone in that studio, on and off camera, was fully present. Clara didn't reach for her cue cards. For the first time, she wasn't interviewing. She was listening. Jordan leaned forward, lowering his voice so the room had to lean in to hear. You know what hurts the most? He asked. Is that when we finally do the impossible, when we rise, when we break through, the first question we get from people like you is, so, who helped you? He paused, eyes locked on the lens. No one asked how many white-owned companies were funded by old money. No one asked who got them into Stanford, or which family friend introduced them to their first investor at some backyard golf party. His voice dropped to a near whisper, but every word landed like thunder. They only ask those questions when the person succeeding looks like me. Clara opened her mouth but didn't speak. Maybe for the first time in her career, she didn't know what to say. Jordan leaned back in his chair, adjusted his watch, and exhaled. "You want to talk about fairness?" he said with a slight smile. "Then let's start by telling the truth." The broadcast ended in a way no one expected, without applause, without music, without even a scripted sign-off, just silence, the kind that weighs heavy, the kind that leaves a mark. Clara forced a final smile before the cameras cut, but her expression had lost its calm edge. As she adjusted her mic, Jordan simply sat still, straightening his cuff like nothing had happened. But he knew better. Everything had just begun. 30 minutes later, the hashtags started flooding in. Number Jordan Miles, number Let Jordan Speak, number America Now Meltdown. A 42-second clip, Jordan looking straight into the camera saying, "They didn't just cut the mic. They've been cutting our voices for years." Hit 3 million views in under 45 minutes. Twitter caught fire. So did TikTok, Instagram, Reddit. The internet was ablaze. Supporters called him the man who spoke the truth America didn't want to hear. Critics called him a race-baiting CEO, an angry activist in a suit, a grateful millionaire biting the hand that fed him. 3 hours later, major news outlets picked it up. CNN, Jordan Miles, a wake-up call for America's economy. Fox News, when CEOs attack, is Jordan Miles a threat to free enterprise? Business Insider, Race, Tech, and Truth, what the Jordan Miles interview exposed. Back at CipherGuard HQ, Brianna was glued to her laptop, fielding calls while scrolling through a flood of new emails. "Jordan, I don't know if we should be celebrating or freaking out," she said. "We've had over 300 investor inquiries in just a few hours, but we also lost 2 contracts. One financial firm pulled out. An international partner says they're reevaluating." Jordan sat in his chair holding a coffee he hadn't touched. "I expected that," he said quietly. Brianna didn't look up. "Well, we're just getting started." 6 hours later, Jordan's phone was buzzing nonstop. Texts, alerts, security flags, and then an urgent call from building reception. "We've received a package, no return address, left at the front entrance." Security opened it with gloves. Inside, a single thick sheet of paper. One word, bold capital letters, "Enough." Jordan stared at it. No sender, no explanation, just the message, loud and chilling. Brianna picked it up, eyes narrowing. "We need to upgrade your security immediately." That night, Jordan sat alone in his office. The city lights of downtown Austin glittered below him, but up here, it felt distant, like another world. He thought of the garage in Detroit where it all started, of writing code on a used laptop, running extension cords to a neighbor's outlet just to keep the server alive. He hadn't built CipherGuard to become a symbol. He just wanted to create something that mattered. But now, whether he liked it or not, he had become the symbol. Brianna entered quietly, holding her phone. "Jordan, we got a voicemail. No name, just 3 words." She pressed play, a deep voice, calm. No one to stop. Jordan closed his eyes for a second, then opened them sharp and clear. "They think threats will make me back down." Brianna nodded, her voice low. "So what now?" Jordan looked out over the city, and the glowing towers, the late-night office lights still on, just like his had been in the early days, and he answered without hesitation, "I'm not backing down. If a single truth can shake the whole system, then we've only just begun." The next morning, Jordan sat in his office as soft sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, casting golden lines across the floor. Outside, the city moved as usual, cars honking, people rushing to work, like the entire country hadn't just been shaken by what he said the night before. On his desk sat a black folder, silver-trimmed, stamped confidential. Inside was a formal proposal from a major broadcast network. "We invite Mr. Miles to host a televised special on race, business, and the system." This wasn't just another appearance. This was a seat at the table to lead the conversation. Brianna walked in, handing him a fresh cup of coffee. "I read it. Full creative control if you say yes." She paused, studying his face. "But you've got to choose. Go back to being the quiet CEO, or become the voice behind a conversation America's been avoiding for decades." Jordan closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, he saw the garage in Detroit, the cold nights, the rejections, the doubters, the sleepless grind. Then came that chair, that stage, that question. "Do you really deserve to be here?" He opened his eyes and set the coffee down. "Tell them I'll do it," he said, "but on my terms." Brianna smiled, Small knowing. Jordan rose to his feet, staring out at the clear blue sky stretching over Austin. He hadn't asked to become a symbol. He was ready to become the one who rewrites the rules.